Thank you, babe. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
So, Alberto, welcome to my little party.
Thank you. It's a little intimidating to be here, but fortunately I can't see anything.
Right, exactly. And they're not really listening to us either, so it's just fine. We've enjoyed spending time together on the Knight Commission on Trust, Media, and the Democracy. And so I wanted you to be with us for our event, not only because I find you charming and brilliant, but also I think you have something to say to this audience that they may not have heard. So let's go.
All right.
Has technology destroyed the entire democracy or only the fourth estate?
Neither one. Of course it hasn't destroyed it, but it has impacted both of them. Anytime that you affect a major player like the fourth estate, obviously you're going to affect how democracy functions. If you go out in America and you find news deserts of every shade and variety, and you look at what's happening when people don't know the people they're elected. We're not talking about national news, we're not talking about international news, we're talking about the local people who run boards of educations, who decide what kind of taxes are going to be passed, who decide on zoning ordinances and so forth. And we simply do not know who they are because the work that used to be done to tell people about that isn't being done because the business model broke. That's just a fact.
But is that technology's fault or is that a business model issue?
It's not a fault. It's a part of evolution, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. I think some of the organizations that have really adapted best to the technology, organizations like the Washington Post, are organizations that figured out that technology is national. We have a national product, if you will, and they adapted the business model to the technology that is available. That's actually one of the things that is really a hallmark of Jack Knight's newspapers, and they were, without benefit of ever being in Washington or New York or Los Angeles, at one time they were the biggest newspaper company in America, always staying ahead of the curve with technology. The telephone allowed him to expand from Akron to Miami to Detroit to Philadelphia. In 1948, there was a German engineering magazine that was talking about Jack Knight, this American who wanted to fax his newspaper to his customers. That's the way I think anybody in news ought to be looking at this technology. And if you're local, too bad. It just raises the ante, but it doesn't mean that you get to just simply wring your hands. You have to figure out how to bend the World Wide Web to local.
Good. So you've identified the problem. What do we each do to fix it? What's the role of the technology companies in fixing this broken system or this broken model? What do they need to do differently?
That's a small little question that probably people in this room are much better able to answer certainly than me. But it seems to me that you have to recognize that you have a business, you have a right and an obligation even to run the business efficiently and make money for your employees and your shareholders and so forth. But you live in society. And if at some point what you do has a deleterious effect on society, there are going to be consequences. And in the give and take, I think that's the period we're just entering now, where people are beginning to say, I love the service, but I don't love the impact on what's happening in my town. I do not think that tech companies should go out and support newspapers or local TV or anything like that. But I do think that we need to think about what is appropriate regulation, what do we really need as a society, and then work back from that.
Okay, you said the R word, regulation. What do you have in mind?
I don't necessarily have a specific thing in mind, but I do think it's clear that we have a whole sector of business in America that doesn't have similar responsibilities as any other business. In other words, that is not liable for its statements. It's not liable for any harm that may come as a result of the enterprise. Maybe we should consider how the law of product liability applies to internet platforms and/or social media companies. I don't know if antitrust is the right way to think about it. That's a possibility. There was a time when antitrust was not all about efficiency, but was about just being too damn big. And in the Standard Oil and U.S. Steel days, maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, but I think what's interesting being in this town is that we have a Congress that doesn't really fully understand the business that they know they want to have influence on, but they feel, and I think they've given notice, that they're going to do something. What will they do? Well, it may be that the technology will always outpace regulation the way regulation has been. Maybe there's a different way to regulate. Maybe there's an evolutionary kind of regulation that moves along with the changes in technology. This is a brave new world.
You started to touch on liability for speech or content or thought. Do you want to see the platforms treated as publishers? Do you think they are the same as the New York Times?
I think people who present information, organizations that present information, my personal preference would be, I think they ought to assume some version of responsibility, just as publishers did. What would that mean? My friends that I've talked with at various of the companies say, no, it's impossible. You have no idea about the speed, the volume, the reach, you're right, it is completely different. But maybe that means it will have an impact on your bottom line, because you're going to have to invest significantly more, probably in agents of artificial intelligence, that may not be ready now, but could be ready with possibly more investment. I don't know. What's the better social good? More profit or a more stable society?
Fair point. What about the journalists and news organizations? Did they make some bad deals on their advertising and agreements with platforms early on? What should they be doing differently?
I think, having been a part of that business, I would tell you we don't have time enough tonight to detail the number of things I think we did wrong, starting with Reid Hoffman's really interesting observation about the work that we were initially doing at night. So we were trying to translate audience, he said. We were trying to put the newspaper on the web instead of letting the web, the medium, actually dictate. Look, it's a hard thing to grow up in a business in a world where you grow powerful, you're rewarded, you're lauded, and then all of a sudden the world changes and everybody says, to succeed, you need to change. You need to be more open. You need to engage. You need to do all of these things that news editors really, in the second half of the 20th century, never needed to do. So yeah, there needs to be a real change in attitude on the part of news organizations. But what we really have to have are people who continue to do the job of journalists, people who continue to deliver the news independently. And I think we've got plenty of people who know how to do that. What we do not have are, at the local level, sustainable business models that will support that kind of journalism.
So tell me more about that. I know you've made a big commitment to local journalism. What's going to work? What are the structures you're exploring or supporting?
We've just made, as you know, we've just made a commitment of $300 million, and before you ask me, is $300 million the number that everybody throws out? all I can tell you is that ours is cash, and you can count it. And what we actually are trying to do is to create a series of vetted organizations like American Journalism Project, like The Markup, like ProPublica, like Alan Miller's high school literacy program, like Report for America, which are organizations that aim to put more reporters in local newsrooms, that aim to create more sophisticated, more skeptical, if you will, consumers of information, and trying to rebuild trust at the local level. We want to put more reports, more information in the hands of people, because at the local level, where there is the shortest distance between the report and the reader, where people can actually intuitively guess, intuitively judge whether something is authentic.
I'm so glad you mentioned Alan Miller's high school literacy program, because I'm curious what you think the role of the individual is. What is the role of the citizen? Have we declined in our cultural or civic literacy? We certainly have fewer civics classes in high schools today than we did a decade ago. What's the solution there?
I don't think the role of the citizen has changed at all. The role of the citizen is to be informed and to be engaged. I think what has changed is that the way that we used to get information has been decimated by the technology, and so, as I said, I'll take anything except wringing hands. And the idea behind our initiative is to have a whole slew of experiments that are aimed at figuring out how to preserve an independent and sustainable business that will support independent news at the local level.
So turning back to the online world for a minute, there is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. There's state-sponsored propaganda, essentially. What, if anything, and you know, Europe has moved recently to really limit and ban certain kinds of speech and limit the time for takedowns and put more pressure on online platforms to moderate and regulate speech. Is there anything off limits? We are proud First Amendment advocates in the United States. What should we consider making prohibited or banned online?
I don't think there's a really simple answer for you. I wish I had one. We've been polling high school attitudes toward First Amendment for about 15 years. We've been polling college attitudes toward First Amendment for the last 5 or 6 years. Interestingly, I think we find, especially with the recent college polling, we find a rising countervailing value, which is inclusiveness and anti-hate speech. What I think is happening, we found, for example, at one point, something like 75% of college students in a very, very wide poll were in favor of free speech, and about 69% were in favor of safe spaces. And I thought, well, this doesn't make any sense. Until you think in terms, well, First Amendment has always been something to interpret, has really been an evolution in the history of the United States. It has been thought of in very different ways. In the second half of the 20th century, we had, I think, the most open First Amendment set of interpretations ever. Now you have, except that even then, you couldn't yell fire in a crowded theater because it would cause physical harm. I think what students are saying, a whole generation of people coming up saying, I think I'm in favor of free speech, but I'm also not in favor of free speech that causes harm, that causes psychological or emotional harm, which, while it may not be visible, is just as real. To somebody from 50 years ago, that's incomprehensible. For somebody who lived through the free speech movement at Berkeley and all of the 70s and so forth, that's really very, very hard to understand unless you think of it as a counterbalancing value. So I don't think there are easy answers. I think we ought to start, and in fact, our intent in starting the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University was simply to have an institution that is well-funded in an organization that will presumably last, Columbia University, and to take when we have these balancing discussions, to take the point of view that there is a need for openness and then have the debate. And when that goes to court, then we'll see. The law of First Amendment as to press and broadcast is reasonably settled. It is clearly not settled as to online. We did not know that the President of the United States would become chief Twitterer, and did not know that he was going to set up on his Twitter account a government forum that he then can't kick people off because they disagree with him. That's a lawsuit the Knight Institute brought, and won, by the way, although it's now on appeal. But that's a circumstance we did not, and I think could not have imagined back when we started the Institute. I think all of us have a responsibility to engage in a discussion to figure out what are our limits and try to come back to a core, to our core common belief in free expression. Our right to free speech is not simply as to government, but our right to free speech means free speech for me and for thee.
But what you've just described is such an articulate thread between societal harm, the right to not yell fire in a crowded movie theater, but to reshape that into individual harm. And that's the way you said college students are seeing it today. And that's actually, that thread makes more sense when you look at it as what is the defined harm, and it being a more individual, personal one than a societal one. So where does this go from here? Looking ahead 10, 20, 30 years, what does the media industry look like in the United States? What are some of the values we should all be considering as we're looking at First Amendment litigation and legislation in this country?
I think one of the key directions that I think that polling drives me to is to start focusing on local, because local is where people can rebuild trust, and trust is absolutely essential for democracy. If we were in a dictatorship, power would simply control. We're not. The way we achieve stability is with trust. So trust, I think, a discussion about values, reignite a discussion about what free speech means to individuals. Make it an individual kind of conversation. And I think we need to have a major conversation in the halls of Congress and in America about what is too much, what are the responsibilities of the tech companies, the platforms. What is the continuing value of Section 230? I think that, as you know, we discussed this at the Knight Commission. I think that should be on the table. There's nothing that says that Moses did not bring down Section 230 when he came down from the mountain. And then I think we really we should at least debate it and discuss it. I think we need a Congress that is significantly more tech-enabled than we have. And I guess we could all have our own particular axe to grind, but I think those would be sort of general directions I would go in.
Well, we agree that we should be having that conversation. We might not agree on the answer or the outcome, but it is absolutely the conversation we're having here in Washington, at CDT, in this room, between all of these courses. Any other thoughts for this tech-enabled crowd as they go about their...
I think you have to understand we are living a phenomenal Gutenberg moment. Tom Wheeler just came out with a book I wish I'd written, From Gutenberg to Google. But the fact of the matter is that before Gutenberg, the monks illuminated 1 or 2 manuscripts a year, and there was order. Only a few people got them. There was order. You read it, it had the imprimatur, you knew that it was truth. Now you don't. then all of a sudden, any Tom, Dick, or Martin Luther could run a mimeograph machine and post something on any bulletin board they wanted to. That's the moment we're living in, where they could not handle the speed, they could not handle the technology, they could not handle the reach. Does it sound familiar?
Exactly.
That's the moment.
That is
and they
where we
got
are.
through it, and so will we.
Oh, that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for being
Thank you,
here.
Nora.
We're so grateful. Everyone join me in welcoming.
Thank you.
Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
There's Karen.
Over here?
Oh,
He got off on his
going that
own.
way.